you so much, Shahan, Mr. Gujwa, to UMSA. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and I return you many thanks. It's great to be here with all of you today. Well, our country has just been through a seismic political moment, an earthquake of an election, and a surprising coalition government has come together, much to the shock, awe, and joy, disappointment of many people depending on where they stand in South African society. And today, in the time that we have, I'd like to focus on three things, pursue three avenues of inquiry to help us all collectively make sense of what on earth has just happened in our country, because I don't think we have fully appreciated the scale of the political change that we have just seen. So what I'd like to do then is firstly focus on the election. What happened? I don't think we've sufficiently digested just the election alone yet, and perhaps give you some perspectives on the election and the results that you may not have been able to pick up in mainstream media. As Shahan will tell you, when you interview politicians, some of the most interesting things you hear are actually off the record. So thinking about what happened in this election, and helping you understand exactly why this was the watershed that we've been promised for many decades. Having done that, get on to the juicy topic of the coalition government. What does it mean? To what extent will it hold? And what are the risks posed to the political settlement that we arrived at after the election? And then maybe briefly to reflect on at least one important global risk. There are so many we could talk about in the world right now that may have a bearing on South African politics. The reason why I think that's important is that when you think of, for example, the last government, it wasn't necessarily domestic issues which were its biggest threat, but it was the unpredictable global issues, like the COVID pandemic, that really came to define, in many ways, the government and its trajectory. So, let me begin by having a look at the election. Let's start with the electorate, because something very peculiar and interesting happened in this election. This was a big election. There were more parties than ever before. And yet, somehow, despite the fact that there was more coverage, more parties, there was the threat of the ANC losing power for the first time. And it felt like you couldn't get away from this election if you tried. The enthusiasm of the South African voter took a dip. So at perhaps our most crucial election, we're voting less. And to understand that in a bit more depth, you can think of these categories. So we've got the South African population, which is, of course, rising, as we heard earlier today. Which means that the voting population, everyone who's in the universe between the age of 18 and the oldest person in the country, that's also growing, just by virtue of the population growing. So we have a growing country and a growing possible electorate. And interestingly, the registered electorate, i.e. those people who opt in to voting, is also growing. So for the first time this year, we had over 27 million people registering to vote. So you would think, growing population, growing universe of voters, growing registered voters, crucial election, you would also get more people voting than ever before. But what happened in this election, curiously, and it's still a mystery that we need to untangle, is that less people voted in 2024, despite bigger registration, than voted in 2019. So we have this curious situation in which, as the stakes are rising in South African politics, the number of voters is dwindling. And there's an interesting caveat to that, to the extent there's also a racial voting gap emerging. There's an extremely enthused and excited white electorate, which is turning out at about 70%. And then the black electorate, for whom so much blood, sweat and tears was spilled in actually securing the right to vote is voting less and less, turning out at about 55%. Now, of course, that electorate is much bigger, but it's interesting to me, and again, curious, that black South Africans are voting less and less compared to their compatriots in other communities in South Africa. So having said that, and having painted a picture of what's happening with who's voting and when, let's look at what actually happened, because it's a fascinating and an earth-shattering picture. Before the election, as some of you will know, I have a YouTube channel where I speak to politicians, thought leaders, people in the media landscape. And I had a bet with my producer that the ANC would fall below 50%. I said they would fall below 50. My producer said they wouldn't fall below 50. And the one of us that was wrong had to shave our beard. Needless to say, I kept my beard. But I must say, in the days building up to the election, I was starting to get a bit worried for my beard. Because the conventional wisdom was that even though the polls were suggesting that the ANC support was really going to decline, something would happen when people went into the voting booth. They would hear Sarafina playing and they would come home. And a lot of people said to me, this prediction of yours that the ANC will go below 50 is outlandish. But what happened in this election is not just that the ANC went below 50. If you actually look, and I've seen this misquoted many times, if you look at the combination of the regional and the national ballot, remember we had those 3 ballots in this election. That's the true national picture. That's how Parliament gets elected. You combine those 2 ballots. The ANC fell below 40 to 39.77% of the vote. The national ballot was at just over 40.1. So the ANC didn't just fall below 50, it fell below 40. And that is a seismic event in our politics that probably only comes once a generation, when a massive political party like the ANC, one of the most powerful political parties in the world, given its electoral margins, falls. But when you look at the provincial picture, it becomes perhaps even more breathtaking. Over here you have a map of South Africa, and the yellow dots represent all the provinces where the ANC enjoyed a comfortable majority just 4 months ago. It didn't have to go into any coalition negotiations. It was far and away the largest monolithic party. Here's what happened after May the 29th. It is only in a comfortable majority in 3 provinces out of 9, from 7. The Eastern Cape, my family comes from eMaxhoseni, so the Eastern Cape will always vote ANC. That's just what's going to always happen. The Northwest, anyway, Tata. The Northwest and Limpopo. Right. Those are the only 3 provinces out of South Africa's 9 provinces where the ANC holds a comfortable majority. In 3 other provinces, it's on a knife's edge, either just above 50 or just below 50. So that is in a place like Mpumalanga, which would have been unthinkable before. In a place like the Northern Cape, it fell below 50, just to 49. And of course, there are now 3 provinces where it doesn't enjoy a majority at all. It didn't enjoy a majority in the Western Cape for a long time. Didn't enjoy a majority, or it was just on the knife's edge in Gauteng. It's now way below 50 at 34 or so. And of course, then you had KwaZulu-Natal, where it was decimated. So 4 months ago, we had a party that was comfortably in the majority nationally, comfortably in control of 7 of 9 provinces. And now, we have a country where that party is below 40% nationally and only comfortably controls a minority of provinces. But let's go one level deeper and look at the local picture, because of course, sorry to break it to you, those of you who are suffering from election fatigue, but we have another election coming up soon, in about 18 months. And in that election, we'll of course be voting in local elections, and of course the big question will be the metros. If you look at all of South Africa's metros, and you look at the national election results inside those metros, now of course local elections don't always exactly mirror national elections, but it's a good rule of thumb. The ANC might lose all the metros in 2026, all. The only one it's likely to keep is Yes in the Eastern Cape. In Buffalo City, it still looks comfortable. But everywhere else, from Mangaung, we know that it's already lost places like Joburg, etc. The ANC might lose control, outright control of all, maybe but one of the metros. So at the end of this section, where I've just tried to give you a feel for the election, we have witnessed a once-in-a-generation seismic moment, at least in terms of what the electorate did in this election. For 30 years, we have lived under one reality, and poof, in the blink of an eye, we are in another reality. But I want to come on to what has happened since then, because there have been some important changes which have complicated this picture. So let's have a look now at what the politicians did with these election results. And I would argue that the ANC lost the election, but it won the negotiations. And therefore, and I have to hand it to the ANC's negotiating team, through the brilliance of that team, everything that they lost in the election, they virtually managed to regain by outmaneuvering opposition parties through a divide and rule strategy. See, the ANC figured something out very quickly, which was a stroke of genius. They knew that in these negotiations, the DA faced a simple choice. Either you work with us, the ANC, or you work with the EFF and MK. And we know you are not going to work with the EFF and MK. So we know that we can extract concessions out of you, and that your alternative option, what negotiators call your BATNA, best alternative option, is completely unpalatable to you. But at the same time, they also knew that the EFF and MK would never work with the DA after this election. So they were able to divide opposition parties against each other and then play them off against each other to make sure that they maintained as much power as possible, and they played a blinder. The Eastern Cape loves it. The ANC retained the Speaker of Parliament, crucial. It retained the President from below 40. It retained the Deputy President. It retained the Minister of Finance. It retained the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation. Defense. All the key ministries fell one by one into the ANC's corner because of this ability to divide and rule the opposition. And therefore, from a very weakened position, when we would have expected a change election, possibly to lead to a change government, we have a change election and a continuity government. And that is the paradox in which we find ourselves right now in South African political life. Moreover, on the provincial picture, the ANC is still in government in KZN, despite the decimation. It even managed to govern Gauteng from 34%, and said we don't want any coalition partners. We'll just govern it alone, and they managed to do it. So we sit in an interesting situation in which the electorate has not lent the ANC as much support as it is customary to have, but nonetheless the party is still the main political game in town. And then there was another masterstroke, which is my favorite, which is the GNU. You see, the ANC has again been don't underestimate the ANC's capacity. It has deep and extensive negotiating capital. The ANC quickly figured out that, firstly, we're going to have two coalitions. Yes, I would argue there are two coalitions in South Africa right now. There's a coalition for you, some of you, and the markets, called the GNU. And everyone is absolutely enamored with this GNU. And then there's a shadow coalition. For whenever the GNU partners disagree with the ANC, it just abandons them and goes with other opposition parties. So it presents itself to the gullible in the markets as if it's in one coalition, and when it needs to, it just goes to another coalition. Why? Because it knows that those two opposition blocs will never unite against it. So it can play one off against the other. So what have we seen when controversial questions have come to Parliament, like should impeached Judge Dr. John Hlophe be allowed to go to the JSC? Did the ANC vote with its GNU partners? No. Voted with the EFF and MK, because it was convenient at the time. Markets, don't worry, we're in a GNU. But when it's convenient, EFF and MK. The Bela Act, did the ANC vote with its GNU partners? No. When it was convenient, it went to its shadow coalition. So the ANC is actually in coalition with everyone all at once and no one. I have to hand it to President Ramaphosa. If there's one thing he's good at, it's negotiating for power. I'm afraid my own sense is he doesn't do much with that power once he gets it, but goodness, he knows how to get power. And the ANC has played a fascinating game of positioning itself to get what it wants when it needs it, depending on the partners that it chooses at a given time, and everyone's happy. Markets are happy because they think there's some GNU, and opposition parties, although they're disgruntled, sometimes they get to partner with the ANC when it helps them. So we are in a quantum coalition. You know in quantum physics how something can either be a particle or a wave, depending on when you look at it. Depending on when we look at it, this is a GNU or some other coalition at any given time. And therefore, I think, although this looks unstable, the ANC is still playing the anchoring role in our politics. So, the question is, how long can this quantum coalition last? And no one knows the answer to that question. But I would venture that there are at least 3 important periods that we need to look at in terms of assessing how long this coalition arrangement will last. The first period will be between now and the local government elections. And this is a period in which, at least my current position is that things will remain roughly as they are. I don't see a great incentive for either opposition parties or the governing coalition to break apart before the election. By the way, according to electoral law, an election has to happen 5 years plus 90 days after the last election. Now, the last local government election happened in November 2021, which means that the next election could happen in November 2026 or as late as February 2027. So it would be the first election which would go into a new year because of how late the last local election was because of COVID. So we could go into an era between, say, now and early 2027, where the likelihood is that things will remain as they are. Yes, there'll be fights, there'll be squabbles, left, right, and center. We may walk out of this room and discover that the GNU has broken apart, which would be awkward for this talk, but I don't expect that to happen quite yet. But then, the local government election is really a watershed. Because in truth, what has to happen in that election, if you think about it, is that both the ANC and the DA have to do well. Because if both the ANC and the DA don't do well together, then the knives are going to start coming out in both of those parties. Because the opponents to this arrangement within the DA will say, you see, we said we should never have gone with the old enemy, the ANC. Now we've lost votes. Or if the ANC does badly, then the enemies of this coalition will say, well, we should never have gone in with the DA, the old enemy. You see, I told you. Now we're even worse off electorally. We've lost all the metros. So unless both of those parties do well at the same time, which is possible, then I think we start to see some fractures in this governing coalition, at least. Because it's not clear whether it's in the self-interest of the parties to remain. So let's say that that's early 2027. That will be the first key test. But let's assume that all goes well and that despite the noise of the election, this governing coalition roughly remains in place even after the local election. In fact, maybe it deepens its way into local government, where it hasn't managed to penetrate so far, as those of you who live in Tshwane will know. Then later that year, you can see 2027 is going to be a very important political year in South Africa, because we're going to probably have an election at the beginning, and at the end, we're going to have a massive ANC conference. You know, ANC conferences always come in December, and always watch out for ANC conferences where the year ends in 7, because that means that 2 terms of a president are coming to an end. Polokwane, 2007, that was when Zuma ousted Mbeki. 2017, that was when Ramaphosa beat Dlamini Zuma by a slim margin. Massive. And 2027 is going to be a big one. And the reason 2027 will be big is because, as I can see it now, that will be a referendum inside the ANC of whether this governing coalition was a good idea. There will be a faction that will say the decision to go in with the DA was the worst thing this liberation movement has ever done. We need to get back to our roots, and they will rally around an individual, maybe a Panyaza Lesufi in this province, and that grouping, supported by the SSCP, maybe COSATU, and other more radical elements within the ANC, will be one camp. And the other camp will be the GNU was a good idea, it brought stability, it brought electricity, and it was the least worst option. And that person will probably be an anointed candidate by Ramaphosa, his successor, whoever he chooses. And those two views will battle it out all the way until 2027. And then we will have a new ANC president. Cyril Ramaphosa will no longer be the ANC president, although he'll be president of the country. And if the one grouping wins, bye-bye GNU, quote unquote. But if the other grouping wins, then probably another test will have been passed. So you can see that there are 2 periods so far, between now and probably early 2027, and then the year of 2027 up until December, where there's a crucial ANC conference. If the governing coalition passes those 2 tests, then, of course, the next test would be up until the 2029 election. So you can see that there are many checkpoints and many important moments ahead, and that the year 2027 will probably be the defining moment for exactly how long this lasts. And bear in mind, our last multi-party coalition government lasted for about 2 years, so that's a distinct possibility. Having said that, I'd like to end in the brief time that I have left by just reflecting on the way that the South African situation, because of course we have had a once-in-a-generation political moment, comes to bear on the global situation. Now, this is such a big topic. One could talk about AI, the advent of machines becoming more like humans and humans becoming more like machines, which is happening right before our eyes. One could talk about economic threats and trends and what's happening as we come out of this inflationary environment, what that could mean. But for me, as a scholar of international politics, of course, geopolitics itself is becoming more interesting as South African politics is becoming more interesting. And the interplay between the two will, in my view, probably define the outcome of this coalition government more than some of the domestic challenges. And I go back to COVID, as I mentioned before. There's always some unthought of global crisis, which is a government's biggest test. For me, just to give you one idea, war in the Middle East would be a big one that I would be thinking about. I tried to look at all of these different options and think, what is the biggest possible change ahead? I think that would be massive. And why do I say that would be crucial and important in the South African as well as the global context, of course? We know that there is currently a ground invasion going on in Lebanon as we speak. The conflict there, which began with airstrikes, has escalated to something of a limited ground war this morning. And there is a possibility, I think it's still a remote possibility, that the Israeli-Palestinian question, along with a wider conflict between Lebanon, could threaten to pull in other parties. Lebanon borders Syria, where we know that there is ongoing conflict and has been since the Arab Spring. Things have stabilized somewhat in Iraq, which borders Syria, but then next to Iraq is, of course, Iran. Now why, of course, in Iran, and Russia, and China, and the US backing Israel? So in the worst case scenario, which I still think is remote, as I say, this becomes a global conflagration. But what is also possible is that it just becomes a regional conflagration with global support. And what is also possible is that it just becomes a localized war. Israel and Lebanon have been to war twice already, in 1982 and 2006. But the reason why I think an escalating conflict in the Middle East is something to keep one's eye on is because that would split the South African government down the middle. How would the GNU negotiate its foreign policy in the context of a wider Middle Eastern war, where clearly important partners will favor one side and other parties will favor another side? And with the ANC in charge of foreign policy, there will of course be huge internal debates within the government if there is an escalating crisis in the Middle East. We know that the ANC has historical ties via people through to via businesses through to Iran, for example. We know that the ANC supports the Palestinian cause. We know that the DA supports Israel to a large extent and is more pro-Western in its foreign policy. So what could happen, and one of the biggest risks I see over the next 5 years, is that those fissures, which are currently being kept at bay because the conflict has not escalated, would be dramatically exposed if the war were to escalate. But as I say, right now, what we have is a small conflict which is spilling over into one state, Lebanon. I would keep an eye on whether it goes further out, either eastward into Syria, and whether Iran would get involved. But I stood here, I think, two years ago, and we were all so worried that our electricity grid was going to fall apart. There was talk that the telecommunications infrastructure was going to give out and that we needed to prepare for the real day zero of South Africa. And we somehow averted it. And so, just as we consider the dramatic risks, I am sure that there will be unforeseen rewards and joys and moments of reprieve for our country. Because, quite frankly, we deserve it after all that we've been through. And I hope that this talk has given you a sense of what the political risks, what the political landscape looks like over the next 5 years. Some of its pitfalls, but also some of the opportunities that lie ahead. We've spoken about the election, what it means. We've spoken about the governing coalition, what it really is, and then looked at one predominant global threat which could imperil all of that. And with that, of course, we always have to keep in mind and open our minds to the unknown possibilities which lie ahead. But so far, South Africa has always managed to bounce back. And hopefully over the next years, instead of just bouncing back, we might have a time when we bounce forward. Thank you very much.